The temp nurse. That's all anyone saw when Rachel Torres moved through Sacred Heart's trauma unit at 0600 hours on a Tuesday in March. Generic scrubs without department colors. Name tag reading R. Torres, temp staff in block letters that meant nothing. Hands that moved efficiently but never drew attention. He didn't see what made those hands different. He didn't see the way they never trembled during codes, the muscle memory that made her for placements combat fast, the precision of someone who'd learned to work in firefights. He didn't see the faded tan line on her ring finger where a wedding band used to sit, or the way her eyes closed for exactly 2 seconds every time she passed the chapel. Sacred Heart Hospital smells like antiseptic and floor wax under fluorescent lights that hum at exactly 60 Hz, a sound Rachel learned to tune out years ago, though her body never quite forgot what that frequency meant in field hospitals where the generator was dying. The trauma unit sprawls across the 3rd floor like a living organism, for resuscitation bays with walls the color of hospital green, stretchers positioned at precise angles for code teams, monitors that beeped in overlapping rhythms that felt like a language she'd spoken before this life. Rachel moves through the chaos with invisible efficiency at 0607 hours, restocking crash carts with the systematic approach of someone who knows exactly which trays will be needed before the day breaks open. Anticipating needs before doctors voice them. Her eyes scan the vitals monitors with the sweep of someone trained to read tactical displays, heart rates, oxygen saturation, blood pressure trending, the constant vigilant assessment that was muscle memory from a different uniform. She has a slight limp favoring her left leg, more pronounced after double shifts, a reminder written in bone and scar tissue that some things never fully heal. The other temp nurses gossip in the break room about which residents are cute, which attending physicians have gotten divorced. Rachel eats her sandwich alone, her locker containing exactly one personal item beyond her scrubs and badge, a single dog tag on a broken chain, tarnished silver, tucked beneath her collar and half hidden against her collarbone where no one could see it unless they looked. She touches it once before every shift, a gesture so subtle it would look like scratching an itch to anyone watching. The brass is worn smooth from 8 years of that same motion. She arrives 15 minutes before her shift begins and leaves 30 minutes after it ends. She never calls in sick. She never requests specific assignments. She exists in the margins of Sacred Heart the way ghosts exist in buildings, present, necessary, invisible. When Dr. Ashford arrives for morning rounds at 0630 hours, she knows exactly what to expect. Silver-haired and commanding in his white coat with Chief of Surgery embroidered in navy thread, he moves through the trauma unit like a man who owns the oxygen he breathes. His voice carries the weight of institutional authority, the kind of power that comes from being born into it, family connections to the board of directors, a brother-in-law in city politics, and the absolute certainty that his presence improves any space merely by occupying it. He walks past Rachel 3 times without acknowledgement, his eyes sliding over her like she's part of the equipment. But he pauses at the suture tray she's prepared, organized with surgical precision, instruments positioned for optimal access, sterile field maintained at exact distances, and his smile appears, the kind that doesn't reach his eyes. Perhaps our temporary staff could benefit from remembering which instruments belong where, he says to the resident standing beside him, not to Rachel. She doesn't flinch. The resident's face flushes red. Rachel doesn't move. The hemostats go on the right, not the left. We wouldn't want someone unfamiliar with proper protocol making critical errors. The words hang in the air like smoke. The resident stammers an apology. Rachel continues preparing the next tray with identical precision. Dr. Ashford moves on, his white coat trailing like a cape, and she allows herself exactly one slow breath. Her hands don't tremble. Her jaw doesn't clench visibly. Her face remains the neutral expression of someone who has already heard worse, survived worse, become comfortable with the particular kind of invisibility that comes from being underestimated by people who mistake quiet for weakness. The dog tag shifts slightly against her collarbone, and she lets her fingers brush against it once, quickly, as if steadying herself. By 0800 hours, the trauma unit has settled into its morning rhythm. 2 patients in resuscitation bays, a diabetic complication waiting for endocrinology consult, a post-op patient from yesterday's emergency appendectomy being monitored for infection. Rachel works the northern section, her shift supervisor barely aware of her existence, which is precisely how she prefers it. Invisibility has become a survival skill. She checks the defibrillator pads, ensures the crash cart medications are current, verifies that the oxygen lines are secure and the ventilator settings match the patient's specifications. The work is methodical and necessary. The work is what she's trained to do, what she did in a different context wearing a different uniform, and the hospital has no idea that the person they hired for $40 an hour has already saved more lives than most trauma surgeons see in a lifetime. The intercom crackles at 08 for 7 hours. A voice that belongs to the ER registration desk, clipped and professional, incoming trauma. ETA for minutes. Multi-trauma. Male, approximately 40 years old. GSW and shrapnel wounds. Bagram extraction. Transferring directly to Sacred Heart per military protocol. Prepare resuscitation bay 1 for immediate intervention. The words drop like a stone into still water. GSW and shrapnel wounds. Bagram. The name of that place hasn't been spoken aloud in Rachel's presence for 8 years. Bagram. Not in the hospital. Not in the safe spaces she's constructed around her new life. The intercom clicks off. The trauma unit shifts immediately into high alert mode, nurses moving faster, monitors being checked, medication trays positioned, the orchestrated chaos of a team preparing for the worst. Rachel's hands don't shake. She doesn't sit down. She doesn't touch the dog tag. She simply registers the information the way she registers everything now, as data to be processed, filed, compartmentalized. A patient from Bagram. It could be anyone. It could be someone she knew. It could be him. The thought arrives and she pushes it down the way she's learned to push everything down, far enough that it doesn't affect her breathing or her work or the steadiness of her hands when she reaches for the trauma medications that will be needed in minutes. The sirens arrive at 0851 hours, audible first as a wail in the distance, growing louder with each second. 2 ambulances. The sound of them comes through the hospital walls like a warning. Rachel positions herself in the corner of resuscitation bay 1, out of the way of the attending physicians and residents and nurses who will be leading this code. Her job is to anticipate, to support, to exist in the background. Dr. Ashford strides into the unit at 0852 hours, his presence preceding him like a pressure wave. She watches him prepare, watches the way he positions himself at the head of the stretcher, watches the particular military precision of his stance that suggests his own history, though she knows nothing about him except the arrogance that radiates from his posture. The ambulance doors burst open at 0854 hours. The sound of the stretcher wheels squealing against the asphalt outside, the rhythmic thud of EMT boots on pavement, the coded communication between paramedics and the receiving trauma team. Rachel's hands move mechanically, preparing the final elements of the resuscitation space. Oxygen lines. Monitor leads. The 4 setup that will be needed within seconds. The rotor wash from a helicopter landing on the hospital roof shakes the windows 3 times, vibrating through her chest cavity like a second heartbeat, and then it stops. The stretcher comes through the ER doors at 0856 hours. A man on it. Catastrophic shrapnel wounds across his left side, bleeding controlled with field tourniquets that are already soaked through, his right leg wrapped in an emergency pressure dressing that's been wrapped over and over with duct tape. The paramedics are moving with the controlled urgency of people who know they're losing him. The patient's eyes are closed. His breathing is shallow. Blood is dripping from the stretcher onto the floor in a pattern that tells its own story: massive internal bleeding, trauma to multiple organ systems, survival measured in minutes rather than hours. But she recognizes him anyway. It takes exactly 1 second. The shape of his jaw. The scar across his left temple, a scar she saw him get, remembers the exact moment it happened, a ricochet during a briefing that wasn't supposed to be dangerous. 8 years. His name is Marcus Webb. His rank is lieutenant. His eyes are still closed, but she knows them, grey like a submarine at dawn, the kind of eyes that had watched her take decisions that cost people their lives and his career. The court-martial. The official erasure of Operation Sapphire Ghost from every record that mattered. The way he'd looked at her in that hearing room and said nothing, his silence louder than testimony, his choice to protect her coming at the cost of his own clearance, his reputation, the life he'd been building in the Navy. Dr. Ashford calls out orders. Get him to Bay 1. Full resuscitation protocol. I want 2 lines, type and cross for 10 units, get surgery on standby. Who's the trauma lead? The resident steps forward, but Dr. Ashford's voice cuts him off. No. Get me the attending from yesterday's multi-trauma. Someone with experience. The orders come rapid fire, authoritative, and Rachel is already moving, inserting the 4 before he reaches the stretcher, oxygen mask in place, leads attached to the monitor that immediately begins its frantic beeping. His oxygen saturation is 67%. His heart rate is 142. His blood pressure is barely registered at 72/45. The hemorrhage is worse than the field dressing suggested. He's losing ground in real time. The resuscitation bay becomes a controlled storm of medical personnel. Rachel moves at the periphery, doing exactly what's required, nothing more. Her face shows nothing. Her hands don't betray anything. But she's watching Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the man who testified against her, the man who knew her name when no one else did, bleed out on a stretcher in Sacred Heart Hospital, and she's doing nothing to stop it except the bare minimum her job requires. The dog tag beneath her collar suddenly feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds. She touches it once, quickly, her fingers barely brushing against the metal. Outside the window, the March rain has started, hammering against the glass like applause, or maybe like judgment, and Rachel Torres, temp nurse, holds the steady composure of someone who learned very long ago how to survive the moment when the past walks through a door and changes everything. The overhead intercom crackled at 1,400 hours. Not a code. Not an emergency. Just a single phrase that turned the entire trauma bay into a theater of contempt. Nurse nobody to trauma bay 3. Nurse nobody, trauma bay 3. Rachel's hand stilled on the 4 cart. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The silence that followed the page was the kind of silence that came with watching 43 people in that corridor, and she could feel every single pair of eyes pivot toward her like rifle scopes finding a target. 2 residents smirked. An attending physician whispered something to a medical student, who barely suppressed a laugh. The words didn't matter. The message did. Dr. Ashford stood at the nurse's station, phone still in his hand, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light. His expression was one of performative concern, the kind of mask a man wore when he wanted witnesses to his mercy. When he wanted everyone to know he was the reasonable one. Miss Torres, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a command. A word. She followed him into the supply closet. The door closed behind her with deliberate slowness, cutting off the hallway sounds, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, the cardiac monitor's steady beep, the shoes clicking on tile. In the supply closet, there was only fluorescent buzzing and the smell of antiseptic so thick it burned. Boxes of 4x4 gauze stacked to the ceiling. For bags in cardboard towers. Everything sterile. Everything organized. Everything dead. Ashford's voice dropped. The quieter he spoke, the louder the threat became. I understand you have opinions about Lieutenant Webb's treatment plan, he said, each word a small blade. That you suggested some sort of battlefield medicine to Dr. Chen. Rachel took one measured breath. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a surgical laser. A needle decompression would relieve the tension pneumothorax. The shrapnel's creating a one-way valve. Air entering, not leaving. His lungs are collapsing. Temp nurses, Ashford interrupted, stepping closer, his presence making the air in the closet feel heavier. Don't question physicians. Especially not temps without credentials, without a bachelor's degree in your file, without anything that suggests you understand the liability exposure you're creating for this institution. He paused, letting that word hang, liability. As if her knowledge was a lawsuit waiting to happen. As if her hands, the hands that had held 12 different soldiers' chests open under the shade of a collapsed mud wall in Kandahar, were just a problem to be managed. You understand? Rachel's jaw clenched once. A single tear escaped her left eye. She watched it slide down her cheek as if it belonged to someone else, then wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact. When she spoke again, her voice sounded like still water. Like something that had already survived drowning. Lieutenant Webb has maybe 6 hours. And you just sent away the only person in this building who's kept someone alive with a tension pneumothorax using a ballpoint pen. Ashford's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. For a moment, she saw something flicker across his face, not doubt, but the ghost of doubt, the fear that she might know something he didn't. That fear lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then it was gone, replaced by something colder. You're done here, Miss Torres. By 1600 hours, during shift change when the parking lot was a river of incoming night staff and outgoing day shift, Dr. Ashford made his announcement. Not over the intercom. Something more permanent. Something that would travel in whispers through every break room and on-call room and hallway in Sacred Heart. He found her emptying trash cans near the ambulance bay entrance, surrounded by 40 witnesses, residents, nurses, paramedics, visitors waiting for the sliding doors. He stood beside her with a mop and bucket in his hands, presenting them to her the way a general might present surrender terms. Miss Torres has been removed from patient care effective immediately, he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. Reassigned to sanitation duties. For dangerous incompetence. He smiled. Not a smile of warmth. A smile of victory. I'm sure you'll find your appropriate level. Security stood nearby, hands resting on belts, making sure the message was delivered without discussion. Making sure she understood that this wasn't a conversation. It was an execution, performed in public, with an audience. Rachel took the mop. The handle was smooth plastic, cold, nothing like the weight of surgical instruments. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence, the way every person in that parking lot suddenly found somewhere else to look, something else to do, said everything that mattered. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 18:20 hours. The ambulance bay doors burst open with the force of a controlled explosion. Not a regular arrival. A military extraction. A Black Hawk had touched down on the hospital roof 20 minutes earlier, and now the payload was moving through Sacred Heart's corridors like a biological time bomb. A gurney rushed past Rachel as she was dumping trash cans in the ER hallway, moving at the speed of people who knew someone was dying and every second counted. She saw the patient first, a man's face, grey with blood loss, eyes barely conscious. Then she saw the uniform. Then she saw the rank insignia. Navy SEAL. Lieutenant. Silver oak leaves. 8 years dissolved in a heartbeat. She recognized him. She recognized the scar on his left temple where shrapnel from a mortar round had creased his skin outside the Jolan district in Fallujah. She recognized the way his hands were already reaching for something, a weapon, a rope, anything, even as his body was failing. She recognized the officer who had sat across from her at the court-martial hearing, his expression empty as stone, as he declared Operation Sapphire Ghost a command failure and signed the papers that stripped her of her commission. Lieutenant Marcus Webb. The one person in the world she'd been running from for 8 years was now being rolled past her at 1,800 meters per second, his blood soaking through 3 layers of field dressing, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded like a man drowning in air. Rachel's hands froze on the trash bag. Dr. Ashford took personal charge of Webb's case. He assembled Sacred Heart's best within the hour, Dr. Chen from cardiothoracic surgery, Dr. Patel from trauma, Dr. Morrison from vascular. Rachel watched from the hallway as they disappeared into Trauma Bay 3. She watched as the first doctor emerged after 30 minutes, shaking his head, and stepped back. She watched as the second followed 20 minutes later, jaw tight. She watched as the third walked out at hour 3 and didn't return. Over the next 72 hours, 15 different doctors rotated through Webb's room. She counted them. Memorized their names from the charts posted outside his door. Each one reviewed the scans, the CT showing shrapnel fragments scattered like a constellation through his right lung, pieces of metal too close to the pulmonary artery to extract surgically without triggering a hemorrhage he'd never survive. Each one adjusted the ventilator settings. Added medications. Increased the oxygen. Watched as Webb's vitals spiraled anyway. BP 80/40 and dropping. Heart rate climbing toward 150. O2 sat falling despite the ventilator pushing 100% oxygen into his lungs at high pressure. One by one, the 15 doctors, cardiologists, trauma surgeons, intensivists, specialists flown in from Philadelphia General and Penn Presbyterian, each one quietly told Dr. Ashford the same thing: there was nothing left to do. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. On hour 68, Rachel was pushing her janitorial cart past the ICU when she saw Dr. Chen standing alone in the hallway, staring at Webb's chart with the expression of a man watching the walls close in. She recognized the look. She'd worn it herself, in a mud compound outside Sanjin Valley, watching a Marine's blood pressure bottom out because the field hospital was 60 kilometers away. She knew what came next. She'd lived it. She approached him quietly, the mop in her hand, the smell of disinfectant rising from the bucket like a ghost of competence. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "A needle decompression," she said. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Relieve the pressure, give him time to survive extraction to surgery." Dr. Chen's eyes widened. For one moment, just one, she saw something flicker there. Recognition. The knowledge that she was right. That a person in scrubs was speaking medicine with the precision of someone who'd done it before, done it under conditions that would break most people. Then he glanced toward Trauma Bay 3, where Dr. Ashford was visible through the glass partition, and Dr. Chen walked away without responding. Without looking back. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The ventilators wheezed. The cardiac monitors beeped in the background like a countdown no one wanted to hear. And Rachel Torres, temp nurse and janitor, pushed her mop down the hallway toward a future she'd already lived and couldn't seem to escape. 72 hours. That's how long 15 different physicians had cycled through Lieutenant Marcus Webb's ICU room, each one entering with the same measured confidence, each one leaving with the same defeated silence. Dr. Patricia Chen from Cardiothoracic had spent 90 minutes reviewing the imaging on day 1. She'd shaken her head and stepped back. Dr. Marcus Williams from Trauma Surgery had attempted a second round of arterial repairs on day 2. He'd checked the monitor, checked the blood gas, and walked out without looking at the charts again. By hour 54, the rotation had become a grim procession. Respiratory therapist Donald Kipps had maxed the ventilator settings. Infectious disease specialist Dr. Rajesh Patel had ruled out sepsis. Anesthesiology had tuned the sedation drip and documented that comfort care protocols were being followed. Comfort care. A code phrase for surrender. The monitors kept their mechanical rhythm. The ventilator hissed and wheezed like something alive but drowning. Webb's body lay beneath the white blanket, chest rising and falling on machine breath, skin the color of old wax, pressure dropping with each hour that passed. The shrapnel had done its work perfectly. Entry wounds along his right side had created a cavity of destruction, torn lung tissue, fractured ribs 3 through 6, internal bleeding that the surgical team had managed but not sealed. The pneumothorax had started small. By hour 48, it had become the real enemy. Air was leaking into the space between his lung and chest wall with every mechanical breath, building pressure that was slowly collapsing the lung from the inside, squeezing the heart, stealing oxygen from cells that were already starving. Rachel had watched the parade of white coats from the hallway. She'd watched them pull up the imaging on the computer terminals, seen their eyes track across the CT scan showing the expanding pocket of air, the mediastinal shift, the heart being compressed like a fist closing. She'd heard them use words like complicated and intractable. She'd heard them not use words like survivable. Her mop moved across the ICU tile in mechanical strokes, front hallway, then the eastern corridor, the section she was permitted to clean now that she'd been reassigned to janitorial. Invisible. Exactly what Ashford wanted. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened at 0100 on day 4. The monitor's rhythm fractured. Not flat line. Webb's heart was still beating, but the pattern splintered into something irregular, something desperate. The alarm began its ascending electronic wail. Within 90 seconds, the night team converged. 2 nurses, 1 resident, the on-call attending who'd pulled the shift rotation. They moved with precision but without urgency. They'd already been here for this, 3 times. They knew what was coming. Rachel stood in the hallway with her mop, watching through the reinforced glass. She could see Webb's chest heaving against the ventilator cycle. She could see the oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor dropping: 88, 85, 82, 79, the pressure, systolic over diastolic, bleeding downward like a timer counting to 0. The resident was adjusting the ventilator settings, cranking PEEP to 15, trying to force oxygen into a lung that was being crushed by its own trapped air. Useless. You couldn't ventilate around a tension pneumothorax. You could only drain it. The attending on shift was Dr. Marcus Garrison. Rachel had seen him before, 3 days ago, reviewing scans with Ashford in the coffee room. She'd heard Ashford say, "Marcus, you're one of my best. I need you on this case." She'd heard the way Garrison had straightened his shoulders, the way he'd nodded, a man collecting a favor he might need later. Now Garrison was standing at Webb's bedside, looking at the monitor, looking at the chart, looking at the pressure readout and the oxygen numbers, and then looking away. "Page Dr. Ashford," Garrison said to the nurse. Not a question. Not a request. Rachel's hand stilled on the mop handle. Ashford arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing the cashmere overcoat he'd had on when he left, the one that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. He was a man built like old money, sharp tailoring, silver hair swept back, the kind of face that had never had to ask twice for anything. He moved to Webb's bedside with the deliberate calm of someone who'd trained himself never to appear rushed, never to appear concerned. He reviewed the monitor. He reviewed the chart. He looked at the X-ray on the screen showing Webb's lung compressed to half its normal size, the heart shifted toward the left, the pneumothorax taking up the empty space like an invading army. Ashford said nothing for a full minute. The monitors beeped. The ventilator wheezed. The ICU hummed with its fluorescent light buzz and the ambient hiss of compressed air lines. "Maintain current settings," Ashford said finally. His voice was level, professional, the voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone slower. "Continue monitoring. If the oxygen saturation drops below 75, we'll discuss next steps." He turned to Garrison. "Marcus, thank you for the page. Let's talk in my office." They left together. Garrison followed Ashford like a satellite orbiting something massive. Rachel watched them go. She understood exactly what had just happened. There were next steps. She knew them. A needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, a 16-gauge angiocath catheter pushed between the ribs, releasing the trapped air in seconds. A temporary measure. Brutal, immediate, effective. Or an emergency tube thoracostomy, a chest tube inserted at the fourth intercostal space along the mid-axillary line, draining the air continuously. Or, if those failed, if the anatomy was compromised, if the standard interventions weren't working, an emergency field thoracotomy. The procedure Ashford had forbidden her to suggest. The procedure she'd learned in Helmand Province when a SEAL had taken shrapnel and a specialist with a stethoscope and a prayer wouldn't save him, but a combat knife and hands that knew where to cut would. But Ashford wasn't going to call for those procedures. Rachel understood that too. He was going to wait. He was going to let Webb's numbers decline gradually, continuously, until the decline became terminal. Then he would document that the patient had received the best available care from 15 different physicians and that sometimes, despite our best efforts, the human body fails us. The liability protection was complete. The hospital was untouchable. And the woman who'd been forbidden from patient care couldn't testify that she'd been right. Rachel pushed her mop toward the supply closet. She needed to fill the bucket again. The floors would need cleaning. There would always be floors needing cleaning. At 02:30, Webb's daughter arrived. Rachel knew her immediately, same sharp features as her father, same bearing, same way of moving through space like she owned it. She was wearing a navy dress uniform, the insignia marking her as a lieutenant. She'd driven from Naval Station San Diego in 10 hours straight, probably stopped only for gas. She walked directly to the nurse's station and demanded to speak with the attending physician. Ashford emerged from his office with the timing of a man who'd been waiting for the phone call. He moved toward Webb's daughter with an expression of practiced sympathy, the face of someone who'd given difficult news 1,000 times and had developed the precise angle of concern that didn't read as either alarming or dismissive. He gestured toward the family consultation room. She followed him. Rachel was mopping near the consultation room's glass wall. She could see them sitting across from each other at the small table. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see Ashford's hands moving in measured gestures, see the way his face arranged itself into the expression of a man who cared deeply but had exhausted all options. She watched Webb's daughter's shoulders begin to collapse, watched her reach for a tissue that a nurse had placed on the table. Watched her nod slowly, as if she was accepting something inevitable. When she emerged from the consultation room 38 minutes later, her eyes were red but her uniform was straight. She walked directly to her father's ICU room and pulled the visitor's chair close to the bed. She sat down. She took his hand. She didn't leave. Rachel had touched the dog tag beneath her scrubs. The single tag on the broken chain that she'd kept hidden under her clothes for 8 years. The tag that read not her name but her call sign, the one she wasn't supposed to have survived to use again. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the metal edges bite into her skin, feeling the weight of it settle against her ribs. She understood what Webb's daughter was doing. She was saying goodbye. She was sitting vigil with a man whose time was measured now not in days but in hours, in the gap between this moment and the moment when the monitors would stop beeping and the room would go quiet in the way that only a dead man's room ever goes quiet. The cardiac monitor began its irregular rhythm again. O2 saturation dropping, 82, 79, 76. Blood pressure collapsing, 94/51, then 87/48. Webb's body was in full metabolic crisis, the pneumothorax compressing everything that kept him alive, the standard protocols exhausted, the 15 physicians who'd cycled through having done everything that institutional medicine knew how to do. At 0400, the night resident looked at the chart and looked at the monitor and looked at Webb's daughter sitting vigil at the bedside, and she made a choice. She didn't page Ashford. She didn't call for additional interventions. She simply documented the vital signs and increased the morphine drip and let the patient's body do what it was already doing, fail. Rachel pushed her mop. The hallway needed cleaning. It always needed cleaning. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of Sacred Heart Hospital, in the spaces where nobody saw and nothing was documented, the real war was being lost not to the enemy but to the silence of people who knew better and said nothing. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless electric song. The ventilator wheezed. The monitor beeped its countdown. And Rachel Torres, the invisible woman in the hallway, the one nobody was supposed to talk to, the one everybody was supposed to forget, she watched the pressure drop and understood that the next decision would be made not by doctors but by death, and that death didn't need permission from anyone at all. The monitor screamed at 0300 hours. One long digital wail that cut through the ICU's hushed darkness like a siren announcing the end of something. 2 nurses and a resident froze around Marcus Webb's bed, their eyes meeting in that terrible moment when the room itself seemed to hold its breath. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, out, but Webb's heart had quit the conversation. The crash cart sat 3 feet away, untouched. Everyone in that room already knew what 15 doctors had learned over 72 hours. Lieutenant Marcus Webb was a body waiting for permission to die. Rachel Torres stood in the hallway outside the locked ICU doors, pushing a mop bucket with wheels that squeaked like wounded animals. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in surgical white. She'd been assigned to janitorial duties starting at 2,200 hours, the overnight shift, the one where nobody watched, where a woman in a grey uniform pushing a bucket became invisible even to cameras. She watched through the glass partition as the resident looked toward the attending. Shook his head once, just barely. Palliative care. Code status, DNR. The daughter sitting in the corner chair didn't move. Didn't cry. Just sat with her hands folded, waiting for her father to stop fighting. Rachel set down the mop handle. One measured breath. Then she walked. The basement stairs echoed under her footsteps. Her locker was in the staff area near the laundry facility, a small metal box assigned to temporary workers, no nameplate, just a number, 847. She spun the combination, pulled it open, and reached to the very back where she'd kept one thing for 8 years. One thing she'd carried through every move, every job, every night she'd worked 12-hour shifts under fluorescent lights pretending to be nobody. The combat knife belonged to her late husband, James Torres, 8 inches of carbon steel in a worn leather sheath, the handle wrapped in paracord from their final deployment together in Helmand Province. The blade was dark from age, the edge still sharp enough to split a hair. She'd wrapped it in a surgical towel and buried it under her work shoes, beneath the false bottom of the locker, beneath 8 years of running. She pulled on fresh gloves. Snapped them, one sharp percussion sound that split the quiet like a gunshot. Then she rode the service elevator back to ICU, her temporary badge clipped to her scrub pocket. The reader beeped 3 times as she passed security checkpoints. No alarms. No one paying attention to a janitorial worker moving through the hospital at 0315 hours. The ICU doors opened at her approach. Motion sensors. She was still staff, still registered in the system, still a ghost who belonged to no one. The night team didn't look up as she walked past the central station. They were gathering at the code cart, resigning themselves to the mechanics of shutdown, removing lines, making calls to the morgue, writing the narrative of a man who'd survived 43 combat missions only to die in a climate-controlled room with monitors beeping his irrelevance. Rachel entered Webb's room. His daughter lifted her head. Recognition flickered across the younger woman's face, not from knowledge, but from something deeper, from the way Rachel moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent her entire adult life keeping people alive in places where death came for free. Rachel set the knife on the tray table, the blade gleaming under the harsh overhead light. Webb's daughter didn't speak. Didn't call for help. Just watched. Rachel's hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, her body remembering every classroom, every trauma rotation, every midnight in Kandahar when the nearest surgeon was 40 kilometers away and the only thing standing between a young Marine and a closed casket was her willingness to cut. She marked the location, 4th and 5th ribs, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found the exact space, anatomically perfect. 12 years of medical training, plus 12 years before that, watching surgeons work in tent hospitals under mortar fire. Pain was information. Information kept people breathing. The incision came clean, surgical precision, not frantic sawing. For centimeters, clean through skin and subcutaneous tissue. She'd done this before in a combat zone with a combat knife, with inadequate lighting and the ground shaking from incoming fire, with 12 soldiers waiting to see if she'd keep them alive long enough for a medevac that might never come. This was cleaner. This was colder. This was muscle memory without the adrenaline, worse, somehow, because it was just technical. Just inevitable. She improvised a rib spreader from surgical retractors, spreading the space just wide enough. The blood cleared, Webb's lung had collapsed, the pneumothorax pressing his heart sideways in his chest, a mechanical failure with a mechanical fix. She found the shrapnel, a fragment no larger than a pencil point, embedded in the tissue. Cleared it. Opened the space. The tension released like a tire deflating. And then the monitor beeped once. Twice. Then the rhythm shifted into something almost beautiful, a steady line, a pulse, a heartbeat that had decided to continue existing. Sinus rhythm. 2 words that meant the difference between a daughter leaving a hospital alone or walking out with her father's hand in hers. Webb's chest rose and fell under Rachel's hands. She could feel it, the steady pump, the return of circulation, the body deciding it wasn't finished yet. She kept her hands steady, her breathing even, her face blank as white paint. This was what she'd done in Kandahar. This was what she'd been erased for doing. 20 minutes later, when Webb's heart had proven it could beat on its own, when the monitor showed stable rhythm and adequate oxygenation, Dr. Ashford pushed through the ICU doors. His eyes found Rachel first, hand still inside Webb's chest cavity, blood up to her elbows, the combat knife on the tray table, Webb's daughter standing frozen in the corner like a witness to something that couldn't possibly be real. Ashford's face went white, then red, then something beyond anger, something that looked like watching your entire authority structure collapse in real time. He stepped closer, stared at the monitor, stared at Webb's rising oxygen saturation, stared at Rachel's face, which showed nothing at all. "What have you done?" he whispered. Not a question. An accusation. Rachel withdrew her hands. Moved to the sink. Began washing the blood away, running cool water over her forearms, watching the pink water spiral down the drain. She didn't turn around. She didn't explain. The monitor kept its rhythm. The proof was audible, quantifiable, undeniable. She'd just saved the man who destroyed her. Dr. Ashford left the room. His footsteps moved fast toward his office on the 4th floor, a man with institutional power and nothing left to lose in using it. By 03:30 hours, he'd made the first call to the credentialing board, reporting an authorized surgery performed by unlicensed staff. By 03:45, he'd called Jim Cartwright, the hospital president, and his fraternity brother from Penn, 28 years of friendship and financial entanglement, discussing liability and protocol violations and the career implications of having a janitor perform surgery in his ICU. By 0400, security arrived with paperwork and instructions. By 0415, he'd made the final call to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, reporting an undocumented worker performing surgical procedures, a lie constructed with the precision of a man who knew exactly which legal triggers would disable his opponent fastest. At 05 for 5 hours, police arrived at ICU. Not to arrest Rachel, but to escort her, to witness and execute what Ashford had already arranged. They took her by the elbows, not roughly, but ceremonially, like she was some kind of ritual sacrifice. Webb was still intubated, still under sedation, unaware that the woman who'd saved his life was being physically removed from the hospital while his heart beat steady inside his chest. Rachel's scrubs were still blood-stained. Her temporary badge was still clipped to her waist. She didn't resist. Didn't speak. Just walked out through the emergency exit with 2 police officers flanking her, down through the parking garage where the morning light hadn't reached yet, where her car sat alone in the staff section, where nobody was watching anymore. The restraining order arrived at her apartment by noon. Prohibited from entering Sacred Heart Hospital property within 500 feet. Temp contract terminated for practicing medicine without a license. Criminal investigation pending. Police report filed. The text was clinical, the language deliberate, dangerous incompetence, unauthorized procedures, risk to patient safety. Everything true and everything backwards. Her supervisor called 20 minutes after the order was delivered. Rachel could hear the panic in his voice, the sudden realization that someone he'd assigned to mop floors had been working as a field surgeon. He demanded to know why she'd never mentioned military experience. Why she'd hidden qualifications. Why she'd permitted herself to be demoted rather than reveal her credentials. Rachel was quiet for a long time before answering. Operation Sapphire Ghost, she said. The mission that never happened. Everyone involved was ordered to disappear or face treason charges. I accepted dishonorable discharge to keep the classification. I've been invisible ever since. It was supposed to work. She hung up. Didn't wait for his response. That night, she stood at her husband's grave in Forest Hill Cemetery, rain hammering the ground like applause for something she couldn't quite celebrate. The headstone read James Torres, 1984 to 2014. Force reckon. Everything he was had fit on 16 inches of granite. She'd brought flowers once, a year ago. Hadn't come back since. Hadn't trusted herself to stand here without breaking something inside that had taken 8 years to freeze solid. I saved him, she whispered to the stone. The man who destroyed us. The man who buried Operation Sapphire Ghost and buried everyone in it. I saved him, and I lost everything all over again. The rain fell harder. Her civilian clothes, the ones she wore off shift, the ones that made her look like nobody important, soaked through. Her hands, finally clean, went numb in the cold. She pressed one palm against the granite, feeling the rain and the cold and the weight of 8 years of being erased pressing down like a physical thing. Above, the fluorescent sky pressed low over Philadelphia, holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Rain hammered Forest Hill Cemetery like applause for the dead. Rachel Torres stood at the granite headstone, her scrub soaked through, the fabric clinging to her shoulders like a second skin. The letters were still sharp against the stone, Marcus Chen, 1985 to 2019. Her husband's name. Her failure, carved into granite. She pressed one palm against the cold granite, feeling the rain and the weight of 8 years pressing down like a physical thing. The fluorescent sky above Philadelphia held its breath. She whispered to the headstone what no one else would hear, I saved the man who destroyed us. And I lost everything again anyway. Her voice didn't break. Her hands didn't shake. She was a Marine. Marines didn't crack at gravesides. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd done it again. She'd chosen honor over safety, duty over self-preservation, and the cost had landed exactly where it always did, on her own shoulders, alone in the rain. She drove back to Sacred Heart in her car still wearing the scrubs Ashford had made her wear to the parking lot. The basement locker room was empty at midnight. Her hand turned the combination, 17-34-8, Marcus's birthday, and the metal door swung open. She pulled down the cardboard box of her life, 2 changes of clothes, a photograph, and the dog tag on the broken chain. Just a nurse. Just a janitor. Just a ghost. That's when the boots hit the tile. 2 Shore Patrol officers in dress whites entered the locker room like men on a mission, their uniforms pressed sharp enough to cut. Behind them came an FBI agent in a dark suit, her badge catching the fluorescent light. Rachel's hands froze on the dog tag. No one had spoken that name since her discharge papers were shredded 8 years ago. Major Rachel Torres? The question hung in the basement air like a held breath. She turned slowly, the dog tag still in her palm. Yes. We need to escort you to the ICU. Lieutenant Webb is awake. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The hallway to Webb's room stretched like a corridor in a dream. Her escorts didn't speak. Their presence was ceremony, deliberate, formal, a statement being made in silence. 2 Shore Patrol. 1 FBI agent. And a woman in soaked scrubs carrying a dog tag on a broken chain. The nurses at the station watched without understanding. The orderly stepped aside. By the time they reached Trauma Bay 2, the entire floor knew something extraordinary was happening. Webb's eyes were open. Pale but open. His hand moved on the mattress, searching for something. When he saw her in the doorway, his fingers stopped moving. His eyes locked on the dog tag around her neck, the one he'd worn through 3 tours, the one she'd taken from his uniform when they removed him from the field 8 years ago. His lips formed a single word, Valkyrie. He said it like a prayer. Like recognition. Like coming home. A young woman stood from the bedside chair, Webb's daughter, Rachel realized, maybe 25, with her father's eyes. The girl stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. He told me everything. He said you saved his unit on a mountain in Helmand province. He said you held position for 40 hours with no extraction and brought everyone home. He said you were the bravest person he'd ever served with. He told me to find you. He said, Major Torres is out there, and I owe her everything. Rachel stood in the doorway with the Shore Patrol flanking her like guardians, and for the first time in 8 years, someone had spoken her name and meant it as respect instead of erasure. The head nurse, Dr. Chen's assistant, a woman named Patricia, emerged from the supply room with a file folder in her trembling hands. Major, I need you to hear this. She opened the folder. Her voice shook as she read, for extraordinary heroism in defense of United States personnel in direct combat. Major Rachel Torres coordinated a 4-person defensive position against sustained enemy fire for 40 hours, resulting in 0 friendly casualties and successful extraction of 12 wounded soldiers. Recommended for Navy Cross by the commanding officer of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The words floated through the ICU like incense. Navy Cross. The 3rd highest decoration for Valor. Webb's face crumpled. His daughter gripped the bed rail. Then Webb's former SEAL team leader arrived. Commander Pettigrew, according to his nameplate, dressed in white so perfect they looked ceremonial. He carried a presentation box. His voice was measured, the voice of a man who'd seen combat and chosen discipline. Major Torres, on behalf of the United States Navy, I present you with the Silver Star for gallantry in action. He opened the box. The medal caught the fluorescent light. And 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds sustained in defense of your team. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one a year she'd been invisible. Each one a thing she'd stopped believing she'd ever have back. Rachel didn't speak. Marines didn't accept medals with speeches. You accepted them with the knowledge that you'd do it again, same situation, same odds, same outcome. You accepted them by standing at attention and letting the weight settle into your shoulders where it belonged. The FBI agent stepped forward. His voice cut through the moment like a blade. Dr. Nathaniel Ashford attempted to forge Major Torres's credentials in the Sacred Heart employment system. He filed a fraudulent report with Immigration and Customs Enforcement claiming she was an undocumented worker. When he attempted to access her personnel records to frame her for identity fraud, his login triggered a federal encryption barrier set by the Department of Defense. His access attempt automatically logged to the FBI. Wire fraud. Obstruction of justice. Falsifying federal documents. He's currently in custody. The room went dead silent. Security escorted Dr. Ashford through the ICU 30 minutes later. He was in handcuffs, his white coat gone, replaced by a hospital security escort on each arm. He passed the nurse's station where he'd paged her as Nurse Nobody over the loudspeaker. He passed the supply closet where he'd cornered her, told her that temp nurses don't question physicians. He passed the medication cart where 15 different doctors had cycled through Webb's case, each one stepping back from the challenge, each one admitting defeat. Rachel watched him pass. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Her hand rested on the dog tag around her neck, the repaired chain gleaming now, no longer broken. Ashford's eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. In that moment, something shattered in his face. Not anger. Recognition. The slow, crushing realization that he'd made war with someone he'd fundamentally misread. A temp nurse. Just a nurse. Just a janitor moving through the basement with a mop. Just a woman with nothing left to lose because she'd already lost everything that mattered. Hospital President Jim Cartwright arrived in the hallway 20 minutes later, still in golf clothes, his face the color of chalk. The FBI agent explained the federal liability. The deliberate targeting of a protected witness. The falsified documents. The attempted frame job. Cartwright terminated Ashford on the spot. Medical license pending suspension. Criminal trial scheduled for next month. By evening, the local news ran the headline, Sacred Heart Chief of Surgery arrested on federal fraud charges. By morning, it was a regional story. By week's end, Ashford's wife had filed for divorce, citing moral and emotional abandonment. The medical board suspended his license pending trial outcome. Rachel would learn months later, through Commander Pettigrew, through sealed records declassified, through conversations with Dr. Chen, that Ashford received 18 months in federal minimum security. That his conviction made him unhireable at any hospital in 3 states. That 9 months after his release, someone spotted him outside a strip mall in northeast Philadelphia, selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table, approaching strangers in the parking lot with brochures and a desperate smile. A white coat replaced by a cheap polo shirt with a corporate logo. Authority replaced by desperation. But that wasn't why Rachel accepted reinstatement to Walter Reed Medical Center. She accepted it because her personnel file had been unsealed. Operation Sapphire Ghost had been declassified by congressional review. Major Rachel Torres, United States Marine Corps, 8 years of erasure erased. Her honor restored by the same government that had stolen it. She pinned her oak leaves back on in her quarters at Walter Reed. The gold insignia caught the light. Major. The word fit again. The woman in the mirror, uniform pressed, ribbons in order, dog tag gleaming against her collar, that was her again. Not the ghost. Not the invisible one. Not the temp nurse carrying a mop through a basement. One final visit to Sacred Heart, in uniform, to see Webb before his transfer to Bethesda. He was sitting up in bed, physical therapy having restored enough strength for short walks. His daughter sat beside him. When Webb saw Rachel in dress uniform, he attempted a salute from his hospital pillows. She returned it with parade ground precision. The gesture said everything: 8 years of debt, acknowledged and discharged. Honor restored. The circle closed. Webb's voice was steady. I reviewed the Sapphire Ghost files last week. Everything they declassified. You held that position for 40 hours with no air support and brought everyone home. I was wrong to court-martial you. The Mission Review Board was wrong. History was wrong. I'm sorry, Major. Rachel nodded once. It matters that you said it. Dr. Chen approached after Webb's daughter excused herself. Would you consider consulting on our trauma protocols? Updating our field medicine procedures? We had the answer in the building the whole time. He smiled sadly. You were mopping floors. I was doing what was needed, Rachel said. That's all any of us ever do. Her final walk through Sacred Heart took her past the supply closet where Ashford had cornered her. She walked past the nurse's station where he'd announced her demotion over the intercom. She walked past the parking lot where he'd handed her a mop. The current temp staff watched her pass in full dress uniform, oak leaves gleaming on her collar, ribbons across her chest. She saw recognition dawn on their faces, not pity but understanding. The invisible ones. The ones no one saw coming. The closing image happened at Walter Reed, under fluorescent lights that hummed like they always did. Rachel pinned her oak leaves back on her uniform, standing beside Webb's hospital bed as he saluted from his pillows. The broken dog tag chain, the one she'd kept hidden under her scrubs for 8 years, was repaired now, gleaming against her collar. 2 metals catching light, the dog tag and the oak leaves. Identity and honor, finally aligned. Webb held the salute. Rachel returned it. The moment stretched like a vow renewed. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.